Hello and welcome back to Rappin' with the Rep, or in today's case, Rappin' with the Reps. I am State Representative Ken Gordon, and I'm here with Congressman John Tierney. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for Ken. Good to be rapping with you. Is that the deal?
It's an honor to rap with you. Yeah. We're going to talk about a few topics today, and first one I want to talk about is sequestration. There was a time not long ago that the word sequestration would have sounded like a medical procedure.
Still does.
Yeah, where you're taking something out, right?
Right.
Tell me, I want to talk to you about the effect. First of all, how did this happen?
Well, it happened back in August of 2011. You'll remember that John Boehner and his caucus were sort of holding hostage the whole budget process and the fact of whether or not we were going to go into default. So back then the idea was raising the debt ceiling to pay for past debt, not going forward on that, but they had tried to run a case that this had something to do with spending going forward, and it didn't. But their notion was that they wouldn't stop us from going into default unless there was a certain amount of money cut from just the discretionary spending side, not necessarily the military. So they were going back and forth, and finally they decided they would allow the debt ceiling to be surpassed only if a certain amount of money was cut, and we cut $1.2 trillion over 10 years of spending. And then they wanted another $1.2 trillion cut, but if people couldn't reach agreement on what the cuts would be, this automatic across-the-board cut would go through. They call that sequester. It didn't happen. They never came to agreement on that, as some of us suspected they would not. In fact, some of us suspected that's exactly what they wanted to happen, a way to sort of default into additional cuts on that, so they wouldn't have to look at other ways to deal with our revenue situation. They wouldn't have to cut any tax loopholes. They wouldn't have to make a fairer tax system, on all of that. So they didn't reach agreement, and the sequester came in, and it's a straight across-the-board cut to programs. What people sort of get confused on is they think, the president has a lot of discretion as to what he cut and what he didn't cut. And I know Brian Williams on it was at Channel 4, and Crowley and some of the other folks, even some of our local papers, have written about, the president should have used more discretion. Well, Congress was never going to give the executive branch discretion. So the sequestration made it very clear that it had to be across the board unless a program was exempted by Congress. Every program and every activity. So it goes right down to some pretty fine things on that. And that's been the problem. And it really, although some papers have written that they didn't think it's been harmful so far, well, this hasn't been a heart attack for some people, but it certainly is like heart disease. And it's starting to layer in over the summer here, and it's going to go into the fall if we don't do something about it, and we should.
Who are the people that's affected most, especially in this district, Burlington?
Well, in this district, it's really taken a bite out of Head Start, early childhood programs, out of nutrition, food stamp programs, Meals on Wheels for seniors. Those things have been really impacted immediately on that. Community development block grants, which cities and towns use for development programs, for some job training programs, for a lot of different things that they have the discretion over. Those are taking a beating, and the community development service grants, ways of taking care of people that have, for job training and other aspects on that. So those have really taken an impact. But come this fall, it's going to be on education. It's going to be on research. It's going to be on food inspections and safety issues. All of those things going forward, right down to your national parks this summer. People will notice a big difference in a lot of national parks. So it's going to be pretty important. And as I say, for those people that think, gee, it hasn't really made much of a difference yet, they're either not paying attention or they're not utilizing those things that are getting heavily impacted.
We have a number of veterans living in this district. How is it impacting?
Well, veterans, were exempted out for the most part on that. So they're in a pretty good position as deals with sequestration, but we have our continuing issues with a backlog of disability claims and processing those, which we're working on. We were computerizing a lot of it. The Secretary recently decided he was going to take all 56 regional offices and make everybody work overtime to start working on those claims as well. So we're chopping away at that, trying to get it. Mostly it happens because we have so many people coming out at once from Iraq and Afghanistan with very complicated disability situations. Some of our older veterans, World War II and career, they might have had an incident, one disability issue, but people coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, because the armor got so much better and they were protected, instead of getting killed, fortunately, but many of them unfortunately got some very serious injuries. Plus they may have a PTSD situation or traumatic brain injury. So the processing of all those multiple incidents, multiple types of disability, layered in is really put a backlog out there.
Yeah, we have such a responsibility to people who serve our country.
Absolutely.
And coming back, it's something we've just got to satisfy.
Absolutely, and and we're really working hard at that. The jobless numbers are a little higher for veterans than they are for other people, but it's coming down because we've really put some attention into some tax credits for employers to hire returning veterans on that, some job training programs. which will be impacted by the sequestration and shouldn't be on that. We want to make sure they come back and have that. The GI Bill we retooled so that people in the National Guard and Reserves could take advantage of it, and if they weren't going to, their kids could. So a lot of those things have been good, positive results on that.
You mentioned Meals on Wheels. The seniors are going to be impacted in ways even other than that.
Right.
I would imagine. Right?
Yeah, well, Council on Aging's, which really do a lot. They're a focal point of our communities. A lot of activities go on there. They'll be impacted, and it just has that ripple effect all the way down.
Do you see an end to this? Do you see a resolution?
Well, I think there's an easy resolution. I mean, first of all, I voted against it, so I take this opportunity and any opportunity I have to tell people that I thought this was legislative malpractice from the get-go. It's not the way to practice. You want to be a legislator, then you have to make tough decisions, and you have to set priorities. You know that from your own experience. This was a case of John Boehner and his conference not wanting to make hard decisions. They wanted to cut. They didn't want to change the tax code to make it fairer. They didn't want to get rid of loopholes for corporations and others on the high end of things. And so they let the sequestration go in, and then they could claim, well, I wouldn't cut that specifically or whatever. That's disingenuous on that basis. So, it never should have happened to begin with. We could fix it by passing a budget. I voted on a budget, Chris Van Hollen's budget out of Maryland, which would have had very targeted cuts, set your priorities on that, would have closed loopholes, would have adjusted the tax code to make it fairer and more progressive on that basis, and allowed us to make the kinds of investments that we need to protect our seniors, to protect our veterans, take care of research, which is critically important in Massachusetts, education at all levels. The early childhood really substantially important these days, because all the science indicates that if you get kids off on a good start, you're not going to have as many dropouts, you're going to have more kids going on to a higher education, but also dealing with our cost of higher education and healthcare issues. So yeah, there's a way to do it, and I hope we're going to get back to that and get off the ideology that some people have down there. This isn't really about cutting deficits with many of them, it's about shrinking government. And I think we'll all be the first to know, like any corporation, government needs to be watched every step of the way. I mean, you need to have good oversight. But if you're going to have programs, then you have to be constant and vigilant in your oversight to make sure that money's not being wasted or abused. And that should go without saying. You do that in every corporation, every business that you have. But it's not a reason to stop the government from working, just like you wouldn't shut down your business if somebody pilfered from you on that. And unfortunately, with the ideology down there, some people say, well, something went wrong, let's just shut it down. And the basis, no, there's a distinct role for business in our community, for individuals, and one for government. And we need to do its distinct role, do it well without fraud and abuse, and then and take care of those needs that corporations and individuals won't do, that the community needs done, and the government has a unique ability to do.
Yeah, it's an interesting and important point that you make. I think taxpayers, if they knew they were getting the return on the investment, it would be a different story.
Well, they do, Ken. I think a lot of people try to go around and tell them they're not getting a return on their investment, and you can point out any situation you want. I see in today's paper, for instance, the IRS. All right, they were having conferences and they were spending way too much money. Absolutely, but you don't want to shut down the IRS or defund them, because basically every time you fund them to go out and enforce the tax code, we make more money. They stop people from cheating and from being fraudulent or abusive on that. But you do have to stop the overspending on those conferences. That's what good oversight does. And it shouldn't take this ideological charge on a whole different issue to get to that issue. That should be something we do on a regular basis, oversee all the agencies to make sure that they're not being wasteful in their spending, and that whatever the purpose we set out for in our statute of creating the agency and funding it is what's being followed. Right. So, hopefully that's where we're going to get back to. So people will say, well, I give money to education. I expect kids to have an opportunity to afford and access college. Right. I expect kids to be able to get an early childhood education so they're not dropping out and going to special ed as frequently. And move on that way.
So let's talk about student loans. And speaking of college, let's move on to that topic. We're at a crisis situation, and we've got an opportunity. Can you talk about the student loan program that you're?
I'd be happy to. I tell you, this is an area we've been focusing on for all the time that I've been in Congress. I was very fortunate as a young person to be able to go to Salem State College and work my way through, because the taxpayers had figured they wanted to support higher education. A lot of us were the children of World War II veterans, and we had our first opportunity as one of the family to go there, and we worked and we paid our share, but we understood that others picked up the rest of it on that. That's flopped now. States have been sort of retreating from their obligations on that. So public higher education, you find students paying about 75% and taxes 25%. So they can work a few jobs, but they can't pay for the whole thing. So if they don't get Pell Grants or they don't get other aid, they have to take loans. And in the private schools, it's usually even a higher amount that they have to take for loans. So the interest rates in those loans become very important. It really determines a lot of money that you pay every month. The different types of loans that they have, and I won't go into a whole description of that, but we had lowered in 2007, we, being the Democrats, we had the majority, a 6.8% loan to a 3.4%, helped 7.4 million students. So that was going through, we lost the majority, and it looked like others were going to let it go back up to 6.8. We had a ruckus a couple of years ago, if you remember, and we continued it to 3.4. Well, now the time is up to talk about that again, and some are willing to let it go to 6.8. I'm not, and others are not. Joe Courtney and I have a bill in the House that's keeping it at 3.4%. Elizabeth Warren and I have a bill, she has it in the Senate, and I have it here, that says, you know what, Wall Street banks can walk up to the Federal Reserve window and borrow at less than 1%. Right. All right, that's all off the books. You don't have to worry about, you know, where the money. Why can't our students do that for this one-year plug to fill that hole until we get all of the issues resolved as we reauthorize the whole higher education bill? So we put that proposal out there. I think more saliently is I've got a bill in the House, and Jack Reed and Dick Durbin have it in the Senate. It talks about taking the whole loan thing and looking at it. Say, we have all these different loans. Let's give them the same interest rate on that. Let's tie it into the 91-day Treasury note, and then have the department determine how much more do you need to cover any possible defaults in the administration of the loan. Probably would be 2 points or a little shy of it on one way. So you're talking now about a loan today would be 2.9%, you know, and then a little bit more in the years going forward, but at least you'd be set and you'd be stable and it'd be lower. We'll put a cap on it to protect it from going out of hand like it did in the 70s. And then that loan would be paid for, be budget neutral. A lot of students would save a lot of money on interest costs. And our bill goes further and says all those students who are out there who are carrying that loan debt now, they can write down to that level. Now the economist Joe Stiglitz and others tell me that that'll put $17 billion back into the economy, which is substantial. All right, so these kids aren't going to be putting that money in a retirement account. They're going to be buying a car, moving out of their parents' house, and either renting or buying an apartment, buying clothes for work, doing, you know, they're going to be spending that money, eating, whatever. And that's a good, serious boon for them and for their families and for the economy. We should do that, and we can do that. The thing that others are arguing is, well, that's not market-oriented. You know, they think that we have to lend just like a bank would lend. So we're not a bank. We're the federal government working on behalf of the taxpayer. The taxpayer's policy is we want to see more kids getting out of college, 2 years or 4 years, or with skills. And we want to encourage that. So we want to make it accessible and we want to make it affordable, not a burden on them. So some of these people all talk about they don't want the deficit to be on our children, but they apparently don't have any problem with the debt of a student loan being on them as they go forward. So I understand that they've been making a profit. The current interest rates, last year we made $51 billion in profit off of student loans, but they're using that to mask the deficit.
Right.
Because they don't want to go other places to pay down the deficit. Well, there are lots of other places you can go than on the backs of students and their families. So you can give them a chance to pay a fair rate, cover the cost of their loan, get out and start a life, you know, invest in their communities, and then pay for the other by closing some of the loopholes, making targeted spending cuts, reasonable cuts in other places, growing our economy by putting people back to work and investing in education and transportation and research on that basis. So let's get smart. Let's do this the right way and move it forward on that. Other countries are, you know, starting to get a leg up on us in some of these areas because we've got this sort of regressive notion that, you know, we don't want to do anything. And you see what's happening in Europe with the big austerity programs, in Greece, in Great Britain. We should not follow that path. Every economist, from the very conservative ones to the very liberal ones, all agree that's not the path for us right now. The path for us is putting people back to work, growing our economy, and being smart about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the economy and jobs are the big issues that I hear about
They
all the
should
time.
be. Yeah, we hear, you and I hear about it.
Right.
Here when you go in your district and I go in mine, but you would think that some of these folks, I don't know where they're living, because they come in, and again, it's not about the deficit with them. It really is about this ideological thing of shrinking government. And you say to them, well, your community needs roads and bridges repaired as much as ours do. You need the research for new jobs to come in so we can be competitive against China and Singapore and Germany.
Right.
But they just don't speak to those issues.
Yeah, it's frustrating because if we had a little more money for transportation to repair some of the roads, we would attract more businesses into the district.
You get hundreds of thousands of jobs. You know, if we just, China's spending 9% of its annual income, gross domestic product, on infrastructure, whether it's water programs, sewer programs, roads and bridges, airports, seaports, and they're booming. We used to spend almost 5% of hours. And then, they cut it back, the Republicans cut it back to 2.5, and now they'd like to go to 2. Meanwhile, try to drive down any road in any community and see what's going on there. Your interstate roads are having problems on that, and it affects commerce. It affects the cost of doing business when your cars and your trucks all need repair, when your airports look like JFK Airport, which I think is a disgrace for an international airport, that you fly into any international, go to Dubai, go to even Turkey or someplace like that. The airports are modern, and they're really helping commerce go through, and on that basis we need to be able to make those kinds of investments, because no corporation is going to step up and do it, no wealthy individual is going to step up and do it. We can't just be deteriorating, we've got to be competing.
Right, in fact, government does what businesses and corporations don't do.
Exactly.
As we set up the framework.
And basic research is another interesting area in that. Lots of corporations will do research, but they're not going to do the basic research because they don't want other people coming in and taking advantage of their investment. They'll do the applied research, right? You do the basic, like the internet.
Right.
So the United States government laid a lot of the groundwork on research on the internet. Tons of companies took advantage and created a lot of jobs and a lot of new innovative products out of it. And that goes in with fracking. A lot of government research went into basically how we're going to get gas and oil out of the earth and have these new way of going and getting it. And then private individuals came in and took advantage of that, did their own applied research. Folks that are in charge down in the House right now, John Boehner and those folks, want to cut back on the basic research, which is, I think, eating your seed corn. It's turning around and saying, what about our future? You want to worry about the kids. They've got to have innovative things happening, creative things happening, so that they'll have jobs and be competitive going forward. We can't walk away from that.
Right, and that goes back to helping kids get to school, get their higher education, because not only will your proposals help save them in paying for it, but also it helps our economy, it helps our society and our community, because we've got people better prepared to assist and work on that type of research and fill those jobs, and then attract those businesses that'll come in, because especially in Massachusetts, education is our greatest natural resource, and our trained workers are
so much of what's being affected by sequestration would be badly affected by the so-called Paul Ryan budget. It's both things. It's your innovation, it's your science, it's your research, your education, your healthcare, all things that Massachusetts uniquely benefits from, more so than any other part of the country. So it's important that we fight for those things, and that's without even speaking about the real personal human interest stories of Head Start and supplemental nutritional aspects, Meals on Wheels, and things like that, which are critically important.
Let's change gears for just a minute. You've introduced an interesting bill, the Personalized Handgun Safety Act, which would really personalize handguns, to the owner. Can you talk about what that would do?
Well, we hear a lot of talk about the slippery slope from gun owners who get angry when people talk about any kind of limitation on the constitutional right to own and bear arms. And what I've tried to do with this bill is say, look, we know the Heller case came down in D.C., and it said there's a constitutional right to own and bear arms, and we're not going to relitigate that. I mean, it's not a habit that I think that most of us want to get into, although I see it happening all the time for people on a number of bases. But we should take a look at the case, and the case said it's a right, but it's not an unlimited right. That you have the obligation and the right to say, well, what are you going to do about safety? Who should have those arms and bear them? What kinds of arms are we talking about? Are they common arms or overly dangerous arms? Where should they be used? All those things are reasonable things, and the court went through a whole history of limitations that have been put on them, some supported by the NRA. Back in the 30s, they were against machine guns and for education. So I said, well, I think one of the most effective things we could do is take a look at handguns, which are by far and away the majority of incidents that end up in injury or death. Either the gun is stolen, or it's used in a suicide, or it's used in an accident. And if we could look at that and do something to make it safer, to make that less likely. I saw an article in a whole compilation of articles. It was done by Johns Hopkins. And the professor that had written the article, I got in touch with him, we talked about it. The idea of you can take personalized technology so that only the authorized users of a handgun will be able to fire it. And you can have multiple authorized users on a gun with the technology, and the technology exists. That's the incredible thing. It's existed since the 90s. It's been perfected even as we go along. But manufacturers took the grants that President Clinton put out there, developed it, and then they put it on the shelf. One company out here, Smith & Wesson, they were doing it, and the president and CEO had gone to the White House to work, and the NRA and the other manufacturers went at him so hard that he almost went bankrupt in the company. So now I think the time has turned around. So let's not talk about taking your gun away. Let's talk about making it safe so your child won't be exposed, to accidentally discharging it and others won't steal it and use it. And 17% of the police officers who are killed with their own weapon. That won't happen either.
So I assume you've spoken to some of the police chiefs and some of the
We
prosecutors
have a lot of
about this
support
bill?
from police chiefs, a lot of support from district attorneys on that. We have support of the mayor's group, Bloomberg and Menino in that group. We have the Mothers for Common Sense and Guns Use. We have the Children's Defense League. We got quite a bit of support on that. What we need to do is talk to some of the gun manufacturers and convince them this is a marketing opportunity for them, on that basis, and get them to get away from the NRA's ideology, who think that everything is a slippery slope, and say, why wouldn't you want to market a safe gun?
Right.
On that basis, because right now they're not responsible for anything. If they make a totally defective gun, the NRA's lobbying has led to results, the laws that say that they're not responsible.
That's right.
This bill says, 2 years' time, you have to make a gun that's to the standards going to be set by the Consumer Protection Board, and if you do, you still won't be liable. But if you don't, it's going to be defective, and now you're going to be liable, and there's your incentive for doing it. But it'll be a lot of lives saved.
Yeah, it's interesting when you frame the conversation as keeping guns safe.
Yeah.
It's people do have, Heller is clear, people have the right to guns, but there is some control. And if we're talking about keeping people safe from guns, including the owners of those guns, I mean, the owners want to stay safe as well.
I like to talking about women and children on that. I had an interesting experience. Went to high school in Lynn, and there were a bunch of people, covered the whole gamut, people that didn't want any guns at all, people that wanted nothing but guns, no limitations, and a few people, men and women, young men and women, who thought there should be no limitations at all, until I started mentioning, well, there was a guy and a gal, and they looked like they were pretty steady dating, whatever like that. So suppose you two were living together or married or anything, and you had a child. I said, would you want the gun lying around? Well, right away, the young lady said, no, that's not going to happen in my house. And I said, well, you just told me you didn't want any limitations. Well, that's a limitation I would accept. Like you can't have it lying around. It's got to be protected and safe.
That's right.
So I looked back at the guy who now is looking at her, looking at her like, yeah, I guess that's the case. But nobody wants their child injured. And nobody wants to be responsible. Somebody steals your gun, being responsible for somebody else. So we're talking about responsible gun owners here, and just giving them an opportunity to make their gun safer. And I think one of the things, there's been a lot of disrespect for people both ways.
Yep.
Gun owners disrespect people when they think erroneously people want to take their gun, everything's about taking the gun away. And people that don't have guns sometimes disrespect gun owners and assume that everybody's an irresponsible gun owner and that there's no legitimate purpose to want one. And I think we've got to find that ground which says, all right, you have some legitimate reasons why you want to own a gun. Can you make it safe? And other people say, okay, you don't want to take my gun away, and I want my gun, but I'll have the concession of making it safe. And that's how we used to do things in this country, right? We used to find some common ground and work on that. We got to get back to that point.
That's right. In fact, that's one of the most wonderful things about this country is our right, the Constitution talks about our right to disagree.
Right.
We have an election every 4 years, every 2 years. We can bring our disagreements to the polls.
Well, I don't know how you're doing it in the Boston legislation. I think you don't have the same issue that we have. We have about 80 to 90 members in Washington that don't believe in compromise and are proud of it. So they call themselves the Young Guns, and some of their leaders have written a book called The Young Guns because they're so enamored with themselves. But they talk about not compromising, about this notion of coming down and shrinking government and having everything their way and not compromising. And that's in a sense why John Boehner's having such a difficult time getting anything done. I've known John Boehner for a number of years, and I never found him to be somebody who was uncompromising until this group came in, and I think he feels threatened that he's going to lose his speakership if he can't satisfy them and the people that are afraid of them. And when you get down to a legislative body and say you're not going to compromise, it just doesn't make any sense. You don't run your family without compromising. You don't run businesses in some sense without compromising. But you're certainly not going to run a legislature which is built on the notion of trying to move everybody, or at least a majority, along and get things done.
Right.
So if you've got a majority and you say, I can get this through the House on a party line vote, I don't have to compromise, then you don't know your government, because that leaves the Senate and the White House left to go.
Right. And it's a Congress for a reason. It's called a Congress.
Right. So they've got to decide that they want to try to work in the institution, across to the Senate, and with the White House, instead of just thinking they're just going to throw everything through and then go back to their districts and beat their chests and say, like, well, we had it our way, but we got nothing accomplished.
Right.
How
does that affect other members of that caucus? Because they must be looking at primaries and...
Well, a lot of them have gone home. A lot of the people that used to work compromises with have just thrown their hands up and left. Others are still very frustrated working. Some have sort of just gone along with the team because, as you say, they don't want to go home and have a primary with somebody from the Club for Growth or some other ideological group going against them and steering up with lots of money involved now, since Citizens United, and even before that, the amount of money that can be thrown in there to go against somebody. So we've got to somehow break that logjam and get people to realize that, we can do it. Look, and I tell this to people, and it's a partisan story, but I'll tell it. 2007 to 2010, Democrats had the majority. We were the most productive Congress since 1964. Right? We passed more legislation, over 80% of it in a bipartisan way. For 2 of those 4 years, we had a Republican president. We got it done because we made the right compromises when we had to, and we got people on board to move forward. And that's not being done anymore, and we need to get back to that.
Did you think about that there may come a day when you're not in the majority, and therefore how you act?
Well, yeah, we were not in the majority for a long time. I mean,
Yeah.
like for years before 2007, 10 years that I was there, and we tried to get along with people, and we did, up until about the time the sort of Tea Party group showed up. And I say that shorthand because not all of them are as bad, but they're predominantly that group of, I should say, young guns maybe be the way to do it, who said that they don't want to compromise. But even the Gingrich years, when there was a lot of animosity and tension, everything like that, things got done. Not as much as you would like sometimes or whatever, but we moved the ball forward. But of late, it's people that just have a real disdain for government as an entity. They have disdain for the president, personally, on a really incredible level. You got guys like Mitch McConnell in the Senate saying that he thinks his goal in life was to make sure this president never served a second term.
Right.
Those are disruptive forces in trying to get governance to work.
What role does the media play in it, do you think?
Well, it's a suicide mission here on this. Look, I think they have a responsibility they're not always fulfilling. I go back to the sequestration issue early on. I talked a little bit about guys like Brian Williams and the woman on CNN out there talking about, the president should move the money around. But it was their obligation to know that he couldn't do that.
Right.
Instead of reporting it out and taking the talking points that others are throwing out there politically. So sometimes they fall a little short of the mission, even the ones that are national figures and should know better. When you see local editorials talking about, well, sequester has it really hurt? Then they're disregarding anybody who, is talking in the education field, the job training field, Meals on Wheels. They have to do their work. So I think first and foremost, they have to do their work, know what they're talking about, and secondly, you can't always equate every position as if they're equal.
Right.
And they've got some responsibility. When something's is flat out wrong, you don't put it in the same conversation with something that is right, and then leave the public thinking that it's either just 2 different points of view. And Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann, both Republicans, both fairly conservative, wrote a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And in there, they talked about these young guns and the fact that they're not compromising and being a lot of the problem. But then they also said the press can't do what I just said. You can't validate a crazy position and put it on a plane and lead the public to think they're equal. And they used the example when I was talking with these guys for breakfast with them. They said, today, when man landed on the moon and NASA reported that, we've landed on the moon and you had our first steps there, somebody else would say, no, it was all done in the Hollywood studio. Right. They'd report it as if they were equally reliable positions, and you have to figure out which is true. And that's just not the job of the press. They've got to be a little bit more willing to step up and just say, that's discounted. I'll give you the facts, then I'll tell you somebody said that, but if I've given you the facts, you'll know that this isn't right.
Yeah, what concerns me, I have a journalism degree from Northeastern in the 80s, and it's different now. I think the 24-hour news cycle has caused, I think, some of the agencies to come out and basically to cause people to continue to watch. Yeah. You've got to keep people in fear.
They hyped it up a lot. They put stories out before they're thoroughly vetted, because they've got to fill that space, and then they think that correcting it a day or 2 or 3 later is going to be sufficient. And it's not. People's attention span, they see it and they may not see the correction, and that notion is left with them. So I don't think it's an easy job they have, because filling 24/7 is very, very difficult, but that fever of doing that is, I think, caused a lot of problems.
Right, and it's communication with the public that, as we saw, even as the president mentioned in the marathon bombing story, the Boston Globe waited till they had their stories right. They communicated important information to the public, and they helped this area cope with a very tragic situation.
Well, it can be done. It can be done, and when they're good, they're very, very good and necessary. But when they're bad, it's harmful on that. And I think the other thing is people are in a hurry today. They've got a lot on their plate. They've got their jobs, sometimes multiple jobs. They've got their kids and all their activities. They've got their parents that they may be taking care of. And to pick up a paper is not always the most convenient thing to them. They go online. How do they know which thing that they're looking at is biased and which direction? So it's very, very difficult to sift through and get the information that you need.
tough situation to work through. Do you see this getting any better at all? I mean,
No.
I've heard the word impeachment already being talked about with the president. He's been in there. Inauguration was 7 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's
this is
just
democracy. We voted.
Yeah, we voted, and people have to have more respect. I think you and I talked about that, more respect for the voters and for the process. And I think that's crazy talk from a group of people that, as I say, never liked this president and have always been after him. We didn't politically agree with George Bush, but we worked with him, as I
Right.
mentioned to you, and we got a lot of things done. And we had our debates and our disagreements, and we talked against some of the things that he did. Social Security privatization, we went after him full throttle on that and won that issue. But we didn't disrespect him or disrespect the position. And I sense there's some of that out there when they see something happening that probably should be corrected, to jump immediately to we should impeach the president. Look, any large bureaucratic system, whether it's General Motors or Google or the Department of Defense, are going to have problems on that. And the notion, if you're the legislator, like you try to pass the right legislation that sets it right on the beginning course, but then you oversee. That's an important function on that. And one of the committees I'm on is government oversight and reform. I take it very seriously. I'm a progressive. I like things that government does that it should do in education and job training, healthcare. You can only do those if you can convince the public that you're looking over the shoulder of those agencies and you're cleaning up any mess that they might make. Just like if you're working in a company, there's always, or generally, somebody in charge of making sure that everything's working. The efficiencies are there. You continue to do that, and we have to do it as well. But you don't always go for the head of the person when there's an error made at a lower end of that. And if default position is not chop off the head, it's like fix this problem down here. And then if it's endemic or the person at the head is doing something terribly wrong and you know that factually, then you might worry about that. But I think people are talking that kind of impeachment stuff are just really getting too political without any evidence or any basis on that. And if they spent more time trying to legislate and oversee and do their job, would all be better off for it.
It's fascinating. And I wish we had another half hour to spend with you.
Yeah.
Congressman Tierney, thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is Ken Gordon. This is Rappin with the Rep. Tune in next time. Thank you.